Edit.
Welcome back, everyone. This is Professor Lindsay, and this is yet another video on the fundamentals of music theory. This is our third in a sequence of 3 videos about non-chord tones, tones that are analyzed outside the context of the harmony for a given moment. So as before, we'll dive into some excerpts and then see how some of these non-chord tones play out in context. Let's start in with our first one. So I want us to start off by doing a Roman numeral analysis of these 3 bars. First, I want you to pay attention to the fact that we have the bottom hand is not sticking in bass clef. It starts off in bass clef at the beginning of the staff, but then notice we have a little treble clef. This is what happens when we have a grand staff and either the top staff becomes a bass clef or the bottom clef becomes a treble clef. This is a piano piece. Both hands of the piano are going to be using the upper ranges of the piano. It happens. But you just have to remember that those 2 notes at the beginning are not F sharp and A. We're now in treble clef. So that is a D and an F sharp. So the first chord is D, F sharp, and A. You might look at it and be a little bit intimidated by the fact that we have all of these noodly notes going on the right hand. But let's just look at the big picture. Let's listen to it first, and then we'll talk about what we heard. So as I look through these bars, and it kind of sounds like we just have a 1 chord for a number of bars. Look at that D, F sharp, A in the key of D. That's our 1 chord. And then leaving those noodly parts out in the middle part, second bar, D, A, F sharp. That's just a respacing of our 1 chord again with more noodling, followed by A, F sharp, D. That is once again, our D chord. We just have scale degree 5 in the bass. And this is, as we mentioned in a previous video, a telltale sign that we're probably doing a cadential 6/4 to 5/7 to 1 cadence. So that is the harmonic analysis happening here. Now, how do we make sense of the noodling that goes on top? If I'm going to go forward with the idea that this sounds like just our tonic chord for 2 bars, let's look at that right hand to see what notes are in the tonic and what are the other notes around the tonic. So we have this A moving to B and back down to A, and then A moving to G sharp back up to A. This is 2 pairs of neighbor motion, if you recall how those neighbor tones work. It gets a little trickier when we get to the top. A leaps to D and then goes to C sharp, then E, then back to D. So how do we explain what this configuration is? We have 2 consecutive tones in a row that are not chord tones. So this is what we call a double neighbor. So that's a configuration where we will start on a pitch, go above, then below, and then back to our starting pitch in a pair like that, or start in the pitch, then step down, leap up to the chord tone above, and then step back down to our original tone. I also want to point out that in this flourish, right, we suddenly have a G natural. Is G sharp in the key signature? No. This is what we call a courtesy accidental. And so it is just correcting the fact that we had the previous G was raised as a G sharp. It was that chromatic lower neighbor. So now that natural is just reminding us that after the bar line, we're going to default back to what the key signature says about accidentals. But if we just played a G sharp at the previous bar, it's just reminding us time to go back to G natural as the key implies. So we can see how this plays out a number of times in these first 2 bars, where we'll begin with neighboring motion, then follow it up at the very top with the flourish of a double neighbor configuration. So far, you might have noticed that metrically, a lot of the non-chord tones that we are discussing are occurring on weak parts of the beat. We call these unaccented non-chord tones because these are occurring on a weak beat or an off beat, and that's going to create a lighter passing dissonance that's going to resolve more subtly. Whenever we have a non-chord tone that occurs on the beat or, God forbid, a downbeat, this is going to draw more attention to its placement and is going to create more tension by clashing actively with the harmony to create a more acute sense of resolution. Of the non-chord tones that we've discussed so far, the suspension was our most clashing of them all because it's the most accented by design, taking a tone from a previous chord and intentionally creating a point of dissonance right when the chord moves. Another type of accented tone is a retardation, which is in many ways very similar to a suspension. A retardation is approached by the same note and resolves up by step. So like a suspension, we're carrying over a note from the previous harmony, and then in a suspension, we resolve down by step. A retardation is a similar approach, but instead we're resolving up by step. A lot of times this is occurring at the same time a suspension is occurring. One of those voices is moving up while the suspended voices is moving down. So let's take a look at the Beethoven Violin Sonata in D, Opus 12. And here's what it sounds like, and then I want to talk about specifically what's happening at this point of cadence. So at the point of cadence, I'm talking about these last three chords. So I'm going to look in the key of D, which is where we are in the key of D. My 1 chord and my 5/7 chord is going to be a D and an A7. So looking at the bass, I have scale degree 5 in the bass, scale degree 5 in the bass, followed by 1. And as we discussed before, this could be 5 to 5/7 to 1. But instead, I'm seeing this as a D chord, and that is our 1. So this is a 1 in second inversion again, as we've discussed. That common formula of scale degree 5/5/1 in the bass with a tonic triad in inversion on top is actually a cadential 6/4. This is like a 1 chord. So the 1 chord, as we know, D should have D, F sharp, and A in it. And I notice that we have this B in here, but the A and the F sharp are part of it. So this considered a non-chord tone carried over from before. This is a suspension, and this is what we'd say is interval of a 9th to an 8th above. So I'll say this is a 9/8 suspension. This one over here is a 5/7 chord. This is an A7 harmony. So A, F sharp, E, G, natural, which is already baked here on the G natural there. It's not labeled here, which is kind of interesting. But I think it's just because we had a G sharp down here. So this is just a cadential 6/4 to 5/7. And then over here, this is a 1. This is a pack. But curiously enough, we have a number of notes that are not in this D harmony. So D, but then we have a G and an E and a C. This is all kind of carried over still from our A chord. So notice that this E, still suspended, this is a suspension again, is going to resolve down another 9/8 suspension in our soprano voice. This G, which was the chordal 7 from before, just wanting to resolve down. It's got a little bit of ornament, but we can still think of this as being the kind of suspension it's doing. This is the suspension that is a 4/3 above our bass. And the tenor is what I'm primarily interested in. Notice that we have this leading tone going upwards to our scale degree 1. It's like a suspension because it's carried from before, but again, suspensions resolve downwards and retardations resolve upwards. So this is an example of a retardation. And so I would go ahead and circle that and say RET for retardation, where that is a tension held from the previous harmony, giving us a sense of dissonance, and then resolution. And this ultimately ends up being a pack because it was 5/1. Even with the suspension involved, it's just a more interestingly colored pack. Now remember, we can't just look at the key signature and then from the key signature alone determine whether our scale degree 5 is a chord tone or a non-chord tone unless we're analyzing the harmony at the moment. Scale degree 5 is a chord tone if we're playing the 1 chord, or we're playing a 3 chord, or we're playing a 5 chord. It is a non-chord tone if we're playing a 2 chord or a 4 chord. So in order to figure out the harmony playing at the moment, we need to bring together a range of skills that we've learned thus far, namely, what are the chords within the key, and how do they typically move? Let's analyze a short passage of music to test our abilities. How about you tell me which of these notes aren't part of the chord? Poor Dido, so sad. So let's analyze this, right? So this is a passacaglia, and a passacaglia is a form of music that originated in the early Baroque period. Typically there was variations over a repeating bass line. So the main part of a passacaglia is the ground bass, which is a repeating harmonic pattern over which we have variations of a melody unfolding on top. So our first job here is to recognize the duration of our bass, ground bass, which is 4 bars long. You can see it repeating every 4 bars. And I want you to see if you're able to harmonize what are the likely harmonies implied by this bass line. Go ahead and pause the video for a second and complete a Roman numeral analysis of what you think this bass line might include. Without any other context, I'm kind of seeing this do, ti, do in the bass as tonic, dominant, tonic, 1, 5, 6 to 1. That leap down to so, let's go ahead and make that dominant again. with a kind of deceptive-y like motion up to flat 6. I'll incorporate the E flat here. Then I'll go to a subdominant chord, and then those so's, I will put these both as a 5 chord. I'll say maybe this is like a suspension perhaps, or both 5 to 5/7, and then it goes back to 1 is how I'm imagining this could be harmonized without any other context, but this is a possible way of harmonizing. So looking at what the soprano is doing, how much does this match up to my expectations? I have over here A flat implied by flat 6 chord over C, and C is in that flat 6 chord, so that is a chord tone. But when I move over to what I believe is a dominant function, that so to so in the bass, that C being held over from the previous is clearly a suspension that it resolves down to the chord tone of our leading tone, B natural. So I'll label this as a 4/3 suspension. When we go back to Belinda, that is a C minor chord again. So E flat is part of the C minor chord. And when that progression begins again, 1-5-1, this is all pretty much tracking as chord tones, with the exception of the melisma. What melisma is when we have 2 notes held over a single syllable. The second one, the E flat to D, that D is not a chord tone. We've stepped away from E flat, which was a chord tone, and then leapt down to G, another chord tone. So the definition of by step and then escaping by leap is a escape tone. Notice the second syllable of I. Right now, I said, I think this could have been a flat 6 chord. An F is not in the flat 6 chord, but it is in the 4 chord. So this is just as, I will say this is not a neighboring tone or incorrect tone because there's no other context, figured bass-wise or otherwise, to tell us that that couldn't have been a 4/6 chord. So let's leave that as a chord tone. But we definitely have some ornamentation in pressed with torment. So I will say the A flat is part of my subdominant chord. So then coming down to that G makes that a passing tone. I think that that 5/7 chord in the last 2 beats of the bar means that my F and D are part of the dominant chord, but E flat is passing, and then the E flat at the end of with is anticipating a return to our tonic. So I'll say that is a anticipation tone. And then with torment, May and Do, E flat and C, are part of my tonic triad. D is not, so that is passing. Notice that we have which is on my dominant chord. Yep, that is fine. That lay to May with on C, that is part of a flat 6 chord. We're all good there. Now we're looking at those 2 Gs, and I see that Belinda, we're just doing passing motion, where we have a passing motion between the D and the F. I accidentally circled that D. I didn't mean to do that. That's fine. The D is what we'd call a consonant skip, so we're good there. But of Linda, that D is a passing tone. So on and so forth. This is the process that we would use to apply non-chord tone analysis to a Passacaglia bass line such as this. If you have any questions about this process, definitely leave a comment. So at long last, we come to the conclusion of our study of non-chord tones. I know that it took us quite some time. It took 3 videos to get this all accomplished, and sometimes a non-chord tone video might be rather cursory, where we just see the tone move from one chord to the next, kind of devoid of context, and that's great, but I find that typically that doesn't really match on to what we're going to do with any of this information in the first place. A lot of times, seeing something in a real longer passage where these chord tones working with the long-term goal of a harmonic passage is much more interesting and true to life of how we would actually do an analysis of music and inform the way we would play it. So thank you for bearing with me. And if you have any questions, as before, go ahead and ask in the comments if you want anything clarified or want more information about how we were interpreting something to be a chord tone versus not. In our next video, we're going to start talking about applying this into the methods of writing good melodies and contrapuntal lines. See you next time.